Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to be talking about two particular issues that I see commonly repeated with RxJava streams. Both of them have to do with subscriptions. Let's get started. Thank you for joining me for today's thoughtful episode. If this is your first time here, welcome to my channel. Every week I give you seasoned advice on how to build professional Android apps in bite-sized chunks. Now, let's go on to our first RxJava problem. For our first problem today, a lot of times when people are new at RxJava, I'll see them do subscriptions multiple times inside of a complex chain. So when people start building these chains with multiple steps, I'll see them do a subscribe after each step inside of something like a flat map. A lot of times that looks something like this. At the very beginning of their chain, everything looks good. They start with one step, and that emits something like a single or a completable or something like that. Then they do a next step inside of something like a flat map. And a lot of times, this is where the problems start to arise. People do these subscriptions inside of a flat map. I can tell you from my own experience that this is definitely not the right way to do that, and that's for three particular reasons. The first reason is because you start nesting your call chains inside of each other, and that creates unnecessary complexity. Now, what do I mean by a call chain? Imagine that you have a function, and that function returns like a completable, a single, a flowable, or an observable. Those are the four types of common RxJava objects. Then you have a series of steps after that, maybe flat mapping or some other operations that do some manipulations on that initial RxJava object. And then you end the whole thing with a subscribe. So that whole chain from top to bottom is what I refer to as an RxJava call chain. You want to keep these as flat as possible, so you don't want to have a lot of indentation, because really you want to be using the tool in the way that it's designed, and it's designed to work in a very flat manner. Plus, it's going to make it easier on you as a developer. The second reason is because once you do a subscribe inside of a flat map, you no longer have access to the outcome of that. You can't cancel that subscribe, because you no longer have access to it. It's locked inside of a scope that you have no access to. The third reason is kind of similar to the second reason, and that's because every subscribe returns what's called a disposable. So imagine that you have some sort of complex operation, like a networking operation or something else that's going on in the background. You can use that disposable to be able to cancel that whole operation. And once you lock them away inside of a different scope, you no longer have access to it. So even if you don't plan on canceling your thread at any point, it's really a good citizenship to be able to clean up after yourself. If you're given a disposable for a particular reason, you want to be able to clean up those resources once you're done with them. I've seen this mistake create a multitude of errors, and in some cases, it's even caused some of my steps to run out of order. Instead, I'm going to bring this inner call chain out to the level of my outer call chain, so that way my indentation is going to be rather uniform throughout my entire section of code here. That makes my chains as flat as possible. So, in summary, I really want to avoid nesting my call chains. Keep everything at the same indentation level. That way, whenever you subscribe at the very end, you won't break the flow of your chain, and you have access to all of the disposables, and you can cancel the entire operation. The second common error that I see a lot of people make is forgetting to add all of the possible outcomes to their subscribe function. Now, to understand why this is a problem, we have to understand what the role of subscribe functions are in the context of RxJava. Subscribe is a function that you put at the very end of your RxJava call chain that collects the final result of your flow. Whether it's successful or whether it's an error, it will be reported inside of your subscribe function. Now, the way I like to think of this is sort of like a relay race. So imagine that you have all of your operations lined up at a starting line. Subscribe is effectively the person that fires the gun, and the race starts. From top to bottom, every single step runs in order until you have an outcome at the very end. You cross the finish line. In most cases, we like to think of this as just being success, and everything worked as you would expect. Well, there is an overload for subscribe which specifically handles just a success scenario, and we ignore all the other ones. There's another overload which handles on error and on success, so we have two particular conditions that we're handling. And then there's a third one. We have one that does on next, on error, and on success, and that's also useful for another particular use case. In most cases, I see people just listening for the success case, and they're just thinking about the happy path in this case. They're not really thinking about anything else that could possibly happen whenever they run their call chain. To overcome this issue, it's important to know what type of data we're going to be receiving from our operation. For singles and completables, they're only ever going to have a success condition and a failure condition. For singles, the success condition is going to contain a piece of data, and for the failure condition, it's going to contain an exception. With completables, you're going to have a success condition with no data and an error condition with an exception. Flowables and observables are similar in the fact that they can actually give you multiple pieces of data over time. That's why it's important to have an onNext function. For both of these types, onNext is going to include a piece of information that you need. OnSuccess is going to be fired whenever everything is completed, and onError obviously happens whenever there's an error. And this will also include an exception, just like all the other ones. Now, if you'll notice, for all of the different types that I just mentioned here, none of them are ever going to be purely successful. They always have the possibility of creating some sort of error, or in some cases, an onNext value, depending on what type you're dealing with. If you neglect to add the proper callbacks to your subscribe function, and your call chain, say, emits an error or a next value, and you didn't add that to your subscribe function, your entire call chain is going to stop with an exception. And obviously, if your call chain throws an exception and you're not there to catch it, well, your application is going to crash, and that's going to be a pretty poor user experience. Sometimes people will say, well, my call chain, it only ever emits a success value. That's all I ever do inside of there. And to that, I'm usually like, really? So either one of two things are happening here. Either your call chain is really simple and it's true, you don't need to think about any alternative conditions, or you're only thinking about the happy path. And in some cases, you might run into some scenarios that you're not really thinking about. So imagine that you have a networking operation in the background, and that fails, or you have some other complex operation going on. You really should have at least an onError, so that you're not blindsided if something happens that you didn't expect. Your simplest solution is to add these callbacks to your subscribe function. Now, again, if you're not dealing with flowables or observables, you don't need the overload that has the onNext, because truly that's never going to be called. But you should have at least an onError if you're dealing with any one of these types. Now, these callbacks can be empty if you want. It's totally up to you what you decide to put in there. But what matters is the fact that they're there. That way, the tool won't cause errors for things that you didn't expect to happen. And that's all the more that I have for you today. If you found this video helpful and you haven't subscribed yet, I definitely invite you to do so. I have new content every Monday at noon exclusively for Android developers. I hope to see you next time on Thought Fuel. Thanks, and happy coding!